pleasure to be with you here this morning. Yes, I understood that my presentation is going to be in English. I'm sorry about that. I'll try and speak clearly so that I'm understandable. My name is Linden Farrer. I work at DG Research and Innovation in the Open Science Unit and in a sector called Science and Society. I've been working on responsible research and innovation since 2016, so that's as part of the Science With and for Society program. I was involved in the interim evaluation of that, and involved in developing the work programs, and then in finding ways to try and bring RI into Horizon Europe. And that's essentially the structure of the presentation that I'm going to make today, because I will split it into two parts essentially. One is about what we've done in Horizon 2020. I call that mainstreaming RI, and then the second part is on operationalizing RI in Horizon Europe. And you can guess there that there's already a slightly different emphasis. There's a different way that we go about doing this. So if we start with Horizon 2020, in fact, we go back much more than Horizon 2020. We go back to the 2000s, and this is a very potted basic introduction to the concept and where it comes from. The concept really built on things like technology assessment and ELSI and ELSA, and it came about more and more because we were seeing societal rejection of technologies and the results of research and innovation. In addition, the impact of new technologies was seen to be very difficult to predict, and new approaches were needed. Societal interventions were needed to help anticipate the impacts and increase societal acceptance. And probably the emphasis to begin with was more on the societal acceptance, but I think over time we've increasingly put the emphasis on anticipating the impact, and in fact even arguing now in Horizon Europe that excellence really hinges in many cases on societal intervention and involvement. So of course there's a policy background to this as well. The framework programs of the European Union increasingly focused on societal issues. I'd say from FP5 onwards you can find hints of it in the earlier framework programs, but in FP6 from 2002 to 2006 you really started to see what would become several decades of research dedicated to science and society issues. So we have the FP6 program, Science and Society, and we have the FP7 program, Science in Society, from 2007 to 2013, and there was a lot of research on ethics and governance of new technologies as part of that. And increasingly over the time, it's focused on public engagement and the involvement of different publics in the research and innovation process. So if we skip to Horizon 2020 and we see responsible research and innovation as a concept being introduced, and there was a fair amount of fanfare of publicity around this at the time. So what does it mean? Well, the broad aim is to encourage societal actors to work together during the whole research and innovation process to better align R&I and its outcomes with the values, needs and expectations of society. So in a nutshell, it's getting society involved in research and innovation to do research and innovation better and create better outcomes. Now, there were some key dimensions that were put forward by the Commission for this. These were public engagement, open access and data, gender equality, science education, ethics, with an underpinning attention to governance in institutions and in science and innovation. Some people have been saying these dimensions are not responsibility per se. I think that that's correct, but you try and take any of these dimensions away from an idea of responsibility and you're really on shaky ground, I think. I mean, you cannot imagine a responsible practice without good attention to ethics, without attention to gender equality, without attention to science education. So for me, these key dimensions have always been more about where we need to channel our attentions to help attain responsibility, but of course there's a lot more to it than that. Now, of course, we have a policy. We need to be able to measure how we're doing, and we have a key performance indicator at the Commission that helps us do this. The key performance indicator is citizens, civil society organisations and other societal actors contributing to the co-creation of scientific agendas and scientific contents. Now, even this key performance indicator is rather difficult for, let's say, a project officer who has to make a decision at grant preparation stage about whether their grant under preparation is likely to be doing this. So they were given a proxy question to answer, and that is projects that engage the public. Now, as you can imagine from both the KPI and the proxy question, this encompasses really rather a wide range of activities. For instance, on the one side, from projects that are dedicated to doing citizen science to multi-stakeholder approaches that may not involve civil society or citizens, to projects that are sort of engaging but more closely to dissemination and communication, in fact. But overall, with this KPI and the proxy and the data, we do capture, I'd say broadly, the practices and the essence of responsible research and innovation. So using this, we can map out how we have been doing so far. And this is a fairly recent data extraction graph, and it shows the percentage of Horizon 2020 projects that have been identified by those project officers as taking an RI approach, essentially engaging the public, and it's by program part. So you can see some parts have a really very high level of attention to responsible research and innovation. Those of you who are familiar with the Science With and For Society part will not be surprised to see that more than 70% of its projects are taking an RI approach. Then we have many of the societal challenges where there's a very high level of attention. But I think there's some other things that you can take away from this. I think you can see that across all parts of the program, this engagement, ROI, finds its place in the industrial parts, in the societal challenges, even in some of the excellence parts. The ERC is a bit of a standout. There's data issues there. But overall, you can see it across the program. It's 11.4% of projects, more than 3,000 projects doing this, receiving 11.4 billion euros of EU support. You could say, is this high enough across the program? For some program parts, probably we've reached, in terms of figures, we've reached a very healthy level of ROI in the project. For other parts, possibly not, and we need to use this as a baseline, as a benchmark. But I think, if we're looking at improving things, we need to be looking at improving probably the practices and the depth of this engagement, so that we move it away from this understanding that it's to do with more downstream activities and more about upstream as part of the methodology. But anyway, I think these figures are quite telling and quite useful. This graph is essentially the same, but showing the evolution over time. These points of time are not equal, and they start in February 2018. But what they show is that the figures are fairly stable, but overall there's an upwards trajectory. We can see this with the average going from about 9 or 8% in 2018 to 11.4% in April 2021, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a small increase by the very end of the program, when the Green Deal Call projects are finished going through grant preparation. Now, there are some projects focused specifically on responsible research and innovation outside of Science With and For Society. There are many more projects than the ones that I'm going to just mention briefly here, but these are the ones that mention responsible research and innovation in full in the abstract, and I think of the project. And I think if a project has an abstract that puts the emphasis on ROI in that manner, we can have a high level of confidence that this is a project that's not only focused on implementing ROI, but really developing that ROI evidence base. And we're quite familiar with some of these projects anyway, as being very much focused on doing ROI. We've got Nano to All, we've got the Fit for Food project, and we've got this Bodega one. So you can see this across all parts of the program, from the health program, those that are focused on bio, others that are focused on security. And these are important projects in their own right in bringing a real focus on ROI in those program parts. But then, maybe you wonder, how important was it that responsible research and innovation was in the work program topic text? Did those projects that focus on ROI, because I think we can say that they focus on ROI, and not just ROI hidden within the description of action somewhere, or even taking up a lot of time, but if it's mentioned in the abstract, they're really focused. And when we look at that, in fact, out of those 28 projects that mention ROI in full, not even just the abbreviation, 21 were supported from topics that did not mention RI. And I should say that this excludes the ERC, the MSCA, and the SWAFS programs, because that would inflate things somewhat. You can take two things away from this. The first is that it's not important to mention RI in a work program topic text. I don't believe that to be the case, but perhaps it's not as important as is assumed. I think the main takeaway message is that responsible research and innovation is being selected in proposals across the program, even when it's not mentioned or called for in that topic text. It's become a freestanding approach that's recognized by expert evaluators. So I think this is very encouraging, in fact. So if we move to the Science Within For Society part of the program, I'll mention this because it's been such a hub of attention to this approach. And we have here on the screen some of the key portfolios of projects associated with responsible research and innovation. There are many other portfolios of projects within Science Within For Society, but these are the three that I'll mention right now. So we have a portfolio of projects, 21 projects receiving 53 million euros that are doing co-design or co-creation. They're doing citizen science, they've developed research agendas with society, they're doing frugal innovation with citizens alongside industrial actors, for instance. These are very interesting projects. In a way, they're sort of beacons that can act as an example as what can be done by working very closely with society in terms of co-creation and co-design, and these are across all parts of research and innovation. We have a second portfolio there, which is about opening up research funding and performing organizations to society. And this is because a particular emphasis is placed on changing the way that institutions hinder or support, in particular support, of course, their researchers to interact with society. And we have 15 projects there receiving 34 million euros. Some of these projects are focused on particular disciplinary areas. Others take a different approach. Some are focused just on ethics. But we have a real interesting portfolio of projects there, developing a strong evidence base, I think, for moving forwards in Horizon Europe, where there will be a continued attention to this, because of course we need to, individual projects are all well and good, but we really need to change the way that research and innovation is governed, including in institutions, if we want to make a sort of sustainable change. The third portfolio on here is about opening up territorial governance to society, particularly focusing on smart specialization. This is really about quadruple helix approaches with society developing visions or approaches that are in line with societal inputs. And we have 13 projects here receiving 30 million. And in fact, we cover, roughly speaking, 10% of all EU regions in this territorial governance part. So I think, even in terms of the breadth and number of regions and territories that we involve, we can create some kind of impact there. Now, of course, we have projects that connect the dots that help support all of these. We have one I'll mention now, EU Citizen Science. It's a citizen science platform, which is it's a sort of EU platform for learning and resources and networks and organizations involved in citizen science. We have a project called CS Track, which is the only project that we've put in place to do research specifically on citizen science. We have a lot of projects doing citizen science, but the idea isn't to do research on citizen science, but to do citizen science. So CS Track is a project that's doing research on citizen science, including on those projects that we're supporting. We have RING, which is about international networking around responsible research and innovation and open science. It's been working very closely with UNESCO, built up very strong international networks across the world. And I think this is very important, particularly for many projects, but also for not only infusing other parts of the world with the RI approach, but from learning from other parts of the world and seeing what Europe can learn from elsewhere. Finally, I mentioned the SuperMORI project. This is a project to develop a monitoring system for responsible research and innovation. And it's been doing a lot of work around the benefits and the impacts of responsible research and innovation. It's been developing an evidence base in collaboration with many other projects in these three portfolios to try and put in place a monitoring system that can capture these benefits and anticipate them better. So I mentioned institutional changes. We have two portfolios really that are focused on institutional changes, the territorial and the RFPOs one. What do we mean by an institutional change? Well, firstly, I should mention that institutional changes is the key performance indicator for the Science Within For Society program. So it's one of the key ways that we think we can create an impact in this program. We say that it's a change to how a beneficiary governs or structures itself. It's expected to have a meaningful impact within the institution concerned, and it's intended to last beyond the lifetime of project funding. So it's not a one-off activity, it's not a workshop, it's not a conference, it's something a bit deeper than this. Of course, not all of our projects are focused on institutional changes, and that doesn't matter. We don't need them all. In fact, we don't want all of our projects to focus on institutional changes, but when they are focused on institutional changes, of course, we want these changes to last beyond the lifetime of project and change those institutions and how they interact with society. So in an RI institutional change would be in one or more of the dimensions of responsible research and innovation, or manifesting as a package covering 5 or several of those dimensions. To make it a bit more practical, here are some examples of institutional changes that we've identified, in fact, in our projects. For ethics, it could be the introduction of a new code of ethics for an institution. For gender equality, it could be the introduction of an action plan on gender equality. Open access or open data, it could be on making data management plans compulsory. Public engagement, it could be a spin-off company created to link researchers with industry, or the recruitment of a citizen science facilitator in the institution. Science education, it could be PhD training on science communication, and a full ROI package could be anything from the establishment of a physical new information center to engage with and interact with the public, or in fact a publication on ROI, or the setting up of a sort of institutional repository of practice for the researchers. You might say, well, a publication is more of a one-off thing. It's not really something that's an institutional change, but if this is a document that's referred to in the governance, and the researchers are regularly using this as a reference point for how to conduct themselves in line with responsible research and innovation, then we can consider this an institutional change. And I think it's worth taking a very broad approach to this to capture all of the different kinds of changes that can be impactful, because in some institutions, some changes can be very impactful, whereas in others they would have less of an impact. And it's very specific. So you can see here the number of institutional changes by dimension. These figures are a bit out of date. There was a target to help 100 institutional changes by the end of the program. I think we're going to exceed this based on the latest data that I've seen, at least 4 or 5 fold. So I think, just from the number of institutions that have implemented changes in one way or another through the Science Within For Society program, we've created a lot of impact just there in terms of responsible research and innovation, not talking about all of the other projects in this program and across the framework program as a whole. So building on this, how do we operationalize this in Horizon Europe? What happens to RI in Horizon Europe? You'll be familiar with the structure of the program by now: excellent science, the global challenges that bring societal challenges and the industrial parts together, innovative Europe, which has got the European Innovation Council. Underneath this, as in Horizon 2020, we have a transversal part, one on focusing on widening and spreading excellence, and one which no longer has a science and society name, but is called reforming and enhancing the European R&I system. We will continue to have support actions which relate to all of the dimensions of responsible research and innovation, in fact, under this reforming and enhancing the European R&I system. Whereas in the past, in Horizon 2020, we've had lots of bottom-up actions in SWAFs, such as citizen science and territorial approaches. It's going to focus much more on strategic supports, building on what's been done in Horizon 2020, with the argument that all of the bottom-up and thematic approaches will be taken up by the clusters and the pillars. Something that's not on the structure of the missions. Mission is a portfolio of actions intended to achieve a bold and measurable and inspirational goal within a set time frame. The idea is that you bring lots of different kinds of R&I actions together with society to try and solve these particular areas. What are these different areas, these missions? One's been proposed on cancer, another one on climate resilient Europe. We've got one on soil and food. If you look at the two brochures, publications that have been authored by Mariana Mazzucato, you can see that underlying this is very much an RI type approach in terms of the ethos, in terms of bringing all of society together and channeling this in certain directions to try and solve issues through an R&I. And if you look at how this is to be implemented in practice, you can see that engagement is envisaged at the co-design stage in terms of laying out a pathway in terms of cancer, for instance, about how this could be solved. Is it public health measures? Is it environment? Is it treatment? Is it certain forms of cancer? Is it health literacy? You know, all of this can be decided through co-design with society. Co-creation is expected in terms of citizen science, frugal innovation, multi-stakeholder approaches, and co-assessment is also foreseen, which basically means involving societal actors in helping oversee and provide continual feedback on the progress of these missions. So I think, you know, the missions represent very much sort of an example of RI put into practice to much of an extent, and we would expect RI experiences to be extremely useful in helping make these missions a success once they launch, and hopefully they will launch fairly soon. So here are the legal texts, the regulation and the specific program, some parts of them at least, and some aspects that are particularly relevant to responsible research and innovation. I'm not going to read through all of them. All I will say is that if you compare the legal text of Horizon 2020 with the legal text of Horizon Europe, I would say that there's a stronger basis to operationalize RI in Horizon Europe than there ever was in Horizon 2020. In fact, the legal mentions of responsible research and innovation were really rather limited in Horizon 2020, and despite that, we've achieved quite a lot. So in Horizon Europe, you can see a lot of mentions of co-creation and co-design. Promoting responsible research and innovation becomes an operational objective. Science-society relations becomes another operational objective. And open science, which is not mentioned in this text that I've reproduced here, becomes a modus operandi of the program. And one of the practices of open science is engagement, citizen and societal engagement. And this will be operationalized throughout the program in terms of the award criteria for proposal evaluation, in terms of the key impact pathways, and within the topic texts. So you can see here something around the proposal evaluation. We have the excellence criterion. It's the soundness of the proposed methodology, including engagement of citizens, civil society, and end users where appropriate. And in the proposal form, applicants will have to describe how appropriate open science practices are implemented as an integral part of their proposed methodology. They need to show the choice of practices and their implementation, how the choice of practices and their implementation are adapted to the nature of the work in a way that will increase the chances of the project delivering on its objectives. And if they believe that none of the practices are appropriate, which is perfectly possible, we don't think engagement is required in every project, far from it, but we just think that it's overlooked far too much, then a justification needs to be provided here. Now, this is very strong leverage here from a very small amount of text. It's not only saying that engagement needs to be an integral part of the methodology. It's not an add-on. It's not a tick box. This is something that really is part of the project as a whole, and it needs to help deliver on its objectives. And a justification needs to be provided if it's not a relevant approach. And you know, the expert evaluators will be looking at this, and we can expect, let's say, 300,000 proposals over the course of Horizon Europe. So there's a lot of applicants thinking about whether they are engaging society enough in their project. Maybe they are, but they will then need to provide a justification. And here, this is a really, really strong leverage point for bringing RI practices under the guise of, in this case, engagement into the funded projects. Now, learning from our approach to responsible research and innovation in Horizon 2020, we make an explicit point that this question does not refer to outreach actions that may be planned as part of communication, dissemination, and exploitation. Now, don't get me wrong, these are essential: communication, dissemination, exploitation, but it's not part of the methodology as we understand it here. So those aspects that refer to that need to be described under the impact. Now, if there's something being done in the project which fits between the methodology and the impact, then those parts that refer to the methodology and those parts that refer to the impact should be described there. But you know, I think we make it quite clear, and we try and avoid this conflation of public engagement being sort of communication activities in Horizon Europe. We really step it up, and we really try and get all of the applicants to ensure that they've thought enough about this. We also provide some example project activities. There will be a program guide, maybe that's not the name of it in the end, but a guide to help applicants understand what it is that the European Commission is asking asking them to think about. We give quite lengthy descriptions of what we think co-design, co-creation, and co-assessment might be. Here you can see sort of a shortened version. So co-design activities could be workshops, focus groups, or other means to develop R&I agendas, roadmaps, and policies. They often include deep discussion on the implications, the ethics, the benefits, and the challenges related to R&I courses of action or technology development. And this goes right back to the very start of the presentation, where we're talking about technology assessment and trying to work out, what society thinks and how it can shape technology development. So this is the co-design aspects. In terms of co-creation, it could involve citizens and/or end users directly in the development of new knowledge or innovation, for instance, through citizen science and user-led innovation, but it could be much more than that too. And in terms of co-assessment, it's assisting in the monitoring, evaluation, and feedback to governance of a project, of several projects, of policies or programs on an iterative or even a continual basis. I think this sort of typology helps break down what we've got in mind in terms of engagement. Of course, you can take a different typology as well, but I think this already is fairly good guidance for getting people thinking. So I mentioned the key impact pathways earlier. There's a lot of emphasis on co-design and co-creation involving society and research and innovation. In Horizon Europe, we have a much more sophisticated approach to monitoring. And in fact, it's not really just monitoring. It's actually providing a pathway that should be followed by the funding and the actions that are supported to achieve impacts. And you can see that there's 3 domains of impact: scientific, societal, and economic. And one of those is called strengthening the uptake of innovation in society. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Each impact pathway, each of those 9 impact pathways consists of 3 indicators: a short-term one, which is essentially during the project; a medium-term one, which is about 3 years after the project, but it might be at the very end of the project; and a long-term one, let's say 7 to 10 years after the project. So key impact pathway 6, strengthening the uptake of R&I in society, starts with co-creation. It's the number and share of projects where citizens and end users contribute to the co-creation of R&I content. Now, this is a very strong statement. It's saying that the starting point for creating impact in this particular pathway is co-creation. Now, if it sounds similar to responsible research and innovation in Horizon 2020 and how we measured that, you'd be right. It is very similar, but it's more tightly focused. It'll be based on actual activities because it will be reported by the project coordinator at periodic reporting and not an assessment by the project officer at grant preparation. And it differentiates between different types of engagement, which is useful for us for knowing what are the qualities of these engagement types. Is it citizen science, or is it participating in a debate, let's say? But it also acts as a guide to those filling out these online forms because they can see what we mean by co-creation. The medium-term indicator is around the number and share of beneficiary entities with engagement mechanisms after the project. Now, if this sounds like the SWOF's institutional change key performance indicator, you'd be right, but this time it's mainstreamed to the program as a whole. It's also more tightly focused on engagement mechanisms. It's not all of the other kinds of mechanisms now, it's the engagement ones. And it differentiates by the type of mechanism. And here we've been using our experience of institutional changes in SWOFs to help develop the monitoring options for this. The argument being, of course, that projects and beneficiaries are going to be asked to engage society on a regular basis in their projects and across lots of different projects. And they're going to put in place mechanisms to do this more efficiently and effectively. The long-term indicator is around uptake of R&I by society. And this is likely to be a composite indicator covering scientific, economic, societal, and other policy aspects. But I think overall, over time, we create a very interesting laboratory setting here almost for all of these different projects. And we'll be able to say after 10 years or so you have to be a bit patient for this, that certain kinds of projects doing certain kinds of co-creation activities are more or less likely to be taken up across different societal domains. So I think we have a very strong monitoring system here. I think it also follows the logic of what we've been putting in place elsewhere in the program as well. Now, if we go back to the work programs and compare Horizon 2020 with Horizon Europe, you could see on this table the number of mentions of responsible research and innovation in the work programs, of which these are mentions in the topics. And you can see in 2014, 2015, we started at a very low point, just 4 topics mentioning RI outside of SWOFs, 10 across all of the work programs as a whole. We move up to 2018, 2020, there's a lot more mentions of responsible research and innovation, and there's 22 topics that mention it explicitly. Underneath, you can see what happens for Horizon Europe, and we step back a tiny bit, I would say, but not really completely. We're going back to 11 topics mentioning ROI by name, but in terms of practice, of course, it's now applying across all of the topics, and we can use different ways of describing RI type practices, so it's not completely comparable. But you can see that there's a continuing attention explicitly to RI, whether we exclude or include the era part. And I think this is important to bear in mind, because there's a lot of talk about RI disappearing from Horizon Europe. It's not. It's in the legal text. It's in the work programs at a higher level than it began in Horizon 2020, and we find lots of new ways to strengthen this in a much more fundamental way than we've had so far. And if we look just at topics that request or suggest societal engagement in Horizon Europe, and these are for the clusters, 26% of the topics in the clusters we estimate request or suggest societal engagement, ranging from a high of 62% in cluster 6 down to a lower figure of 6.7%. And some of these translate a little bit into what the corresponding work program parts were in Horizon 2020. But you can see there's a very high level of attention to co-creation and engagement, and we think that it's one of the main ways that we're going to create an impact through the program. So, final slide now. Hopefully you've been able to bear with me. Horizon 2020 saw the introduction of RI as a cross-cutting issue following many years of development. The starting point for mainstreaming was very low, but it picked up speed over time, and we now have a very large number of projects engaging society, and more importantly, RI has become a self-standing approach that doesn't require being mentioned in the work programs at all. It is recognized by expert evaluators for being something very useful. Horizon Europe builds on the lessons learned from RI and Horizon 2020. There are references in the legal text, meaning that it's operationalized as a practice rather than being mainstreamed as a cross-cutting issue across the program. Science Within for Society was a significant investment in the knowledge and capacities in this area, and we really need to leverage this across the program, particularly since Science Within for Society has sort of been exploded to some extent into the clusters and the missions and the other parts of the program. We really need to see this expertise being taken up and used to help fulfill the needs that are there. The era part of Horizon Europe will focus on strategic supports, such as developing RI-friendly governance at institutional and territorial levels, updating research assessment, and developing training. So that brings me to the end. Thank you very much for listening.